In the eastern part of occupied Poland, among marshy plains and cleared forests, in late 1942, there operated one of the many forced labor camps. Its name rarely appeared in official documents. It was listed only as an auxiliary facility attached to a large industrial plant producing components for military equipment. The camp consisted of rows of earthen barracks, an administrative building, watchtowers with searchlights, and several lines of barbed wire. On paper, it functioned as a workplace for prisoners. In reality, it was a place of slow physical exhaustion. The camp was controlled by SS structures. Among the personnel, an increasingly noticeable portion consisted of women recruited from various regions of Germany. The shortage of manpower, the expansion of the camp system, and the strain of the war led to wider involvement of women trained in accelerated courses. They were instructed in discipline, weapons handling, camp regulations, and above all, unconditional obedience to orders. Among these women was a 30-year-old from a northern German city, identified in documents as Anna K. Her biography differed little from that of thousands of others. Childhood in a poor family, teenage years during mass unemployment, and later a gradual improvement when the new authorities promised order and stability. Anna completed short secretary courses, worked in a small office, and then, following a local party recommendation, applied for service in camp security. She had been promised a steady salary, housing, and a sense of contributing to an important cause. Her first impression of the camp was a mixture of anxiety and professional curiosity. She was placed in a separate personnel barrack, given a uniform, and instructed on guard rotations and duties. The women's security staff monitored the internal life of the camp, escorting work columns, checking barracks, supervising food distribution, and verifying lists for transfers to the infirmary or to heavy labor teams. The leadership emphasized that personal softness was unacceptable and that showing pity toward prisoners was considered weakness and a violation of discipline. The system was built to suppress individual doubts. Every directive took the form of an order backed by the threat of punishment. Internal notices described disciplinary measures ranging from loss of leave to reassignment to frontline auxiliary units and, in severe cases, military court. The women were specifically reminded that any unsanctioned contact with prisoners was defined as a crime against the state. When Anna first saw a work column returning in January 1943, she noticed the uniformity above all else. Gray-worn jackets, identically hunched shoulders, and steps dragging through thawing snow. Faces were so emaciated that features blurred into a nearly anonymous mask of exhaustion. She had been taught to view these people as a labor resource, but her first thought was how slowly they moved, barely lifting their feet. The camp had strict food rations. Prisoners received a watery soup of turnips or cabbage, a piece of bread, and sometimes a ration of ersatz coffee. Instructions described these norms as sufficient to maintain work capacity, but the actual condition of people showed otherwise. The infirmary, located in one of the barracks, held dozens of severely weakened prisoners who could no longer work. Mortality statistics were recorded in ledgers, turning individual losses into neat lines of dates and numbers. At the beginning of her service, Anna maintained the expected behavior. She ensured prisoners did not linger at the soup cauldron, prevented extra bowls from being taken, and verified attendance in work groups. She had learned to treat everything as part of the necessary order. She quickly mastered the mechanics of the job, checking lists, inspecting barracks, reporting to superiors. In the routine of daily tasks, personal responsibility dissolved into the broader system of orders. But over time, certain details disrupted the official picture. Arms too thin among those assigned to heavy tasks, long lines in the infirmary, where people received almost no real medical care, shadows of figures trying to divide crumbs that had fallen to the floor during evening inspections. Official explanations blamed wartime hardship and resource scarcity, yet these scenes contradicted such abstract reasoning. Reports from the front early in 1943 were contradictory. Official newspapers spoke of coming victory, but private conversations among the staff grew increasingly tense. Even the canteen for personnel reduced meat and fat rations. Fuel deliveries sometimes arrived late. One administrative bulletin mentioned heavy fighting at Stalingrad and called for mobilizing all resources. The tone resembled both a call to perseverance and a quiet admission of crisis. Her service took place between two worlds. One was the relatively ordered life of the staff, with heated rooms, shelter, and basic comforts. The other was the world of prisoners, who lived every day on the verge of collapse. Official policy demanded strict separation, insisting that the second world be regarded solely within the limits defined by regulations. But constant visual proximity created internal tension that slowly grew. In spring 1943, a new transport of prisoners arrived. Many were women from different countries, along with a group of teenagers sent for forced labor. The new arrivals were even weaker than those already in the camp. Many could barely stand. For the first time, Anna realized that the norms once seeming rigid were, under these conditions, a direct sentence. Records treated the newcomers as fresh labor supply. In reality, they were people already at the edge of survival. The administration responded to worsening conditions with stricter discipline. Staff meetings emphasized absolute obedience. Punishment lists were updated, now including the possibility of involvement by the secret police for showing improper attitudes. In this environment, the first, barely conscious attempts to deviate from strict policy began to form. Anna increasingly felt that each number in the mortality ledger represented a real human life consumed by a system that treated bodies like any other expendable resource. By early spring 1943, she no longer experienced her duties with emotional detachment. She still carried out orders and kept the books, but behind the routine grew the sense that the system's logic was fundamentally incompatible with human survival. These early, barely visible realizations would later shape the risky actions that emerged during the camp's most critical period. The spring of 1943 brought noticeable changes to the camp. The snow melted, exposing trampled ground around the barracks. Thin lines of mud stretched from the gate to the industrial workshops, and work columns passed along them every day. The weather became less severe, but it did not improve the overall condition of the prisoners. Bodies weakened over the winter on minimal rations could not recover. The infirmary recorded growing cases of extreme exhaustion, described in official documents with general medical terms that concealed the scale of suffering. During this period, Anna was reassigned to duties connected with supervising the distribution of food. Her task was to attend the issuance of soup and bread in several barracks, verify portion numbers according to established norms, and report any deviations. Officially, this was a routine rotation designed to reinforce discipline and prevent misuse by prisoners. In reality, it placed Anna at the center of the daily struggle for survival. She observed long queues at the soup cauldron. Prisoners carried metal bowls, cups, or fragments of saved utensils. Their movements were slow, but tense. As they approached the ladle, many stretched their necks slightly, trying to estimate how much soup would fall into their container. The soup was a thin broth of water with small shreds of vegetables, mostly turnips, sometimes a trace of grain. Bread was cut into pieces of strictly regulated weight. Anna recorded the number of distributed portions. She had been trained to watch for attempts to obtain a second serving or to hide an already received piece of bread. But watching prisoners cling to every crumb, she gradually stopped interpreting these actions as violations. They were expressions of basic, instinctive survival. A person barely able to stand did not distinguish between a legal or illegal ladle of soup. Her first conscious deviation from instructions came almost imperceptibly. One day, she noticed that several loaves had been cut unevenly. Some pieces were thinner, some thicker. According to regulations, she was required to trim the larger pieces and return the excess to the kitchen. She picked up one of the thicker portions, estimated its weight, and realized it exceeded the norm. Instead of dividing it, she quietly moved it to the side among the other pieces. When distribution began, one prisoner received that larger slice. Anna only noticed how tightly he held it, as if it were an unexpected gift. No one checked that day, and the ledger matched the official numbers. But the boundary between strict obedience and deliberate deviation had been crossed. Over time, her actions became more deliberate. Anna discovered subtle gaps in the system of control. Instructions were harsh, but not every point in the supply chain was monitored with equal vigilance. The kitchen operated under constant pressure, especially on days when new transports arrived. In the rush to prepare multiple cauldrons, precise accounting often weakened. The women assigned to supervise the process focused mainly on preventing prisoners from approaching the building. Anna saw an opportunity. She began to notice those prisoners whose condition was most critical, those who staggered in the work columns, those supported by others, those whose infirmary notes indicated the need for lighter duties but who still worked full shifts. When possible, she allowed them a slightly fuller ladle of soup or left a larger piece of bread within reach. These acts occurred without words, through almost invisible adjustments in procedure. Soon she realized she was not alone. In the staff canteen, she noticed subtle behavior from other women. One older colleague made a cautious remark that reports from the front sounded less optimistic than official statements suggested. Although the comment was vague, its tone implied doubt. In a place where dissent could not be expressed openly, such doubts surfaced through small, hidden actions. Some women working in the laundry or clothing depot occasionally made similar deviations. They issued slightly warmer garments to those suffering in the cold or delayed the discarding of worn jackets so prisoners could use them longer. All of this took place beneath the surface of official discipline. The ledgers contained precise numbers, yet beneath them lay a fragile layer of informal practices. Control remained strict. Periodic inspections compared documented supply data with physical inventory. Any discrepancy could be labeled misuse or negligence. The staff were watched almost as closely as the prisoners. Anna understood that every action carried risk. If a cauldron appeared underfilled or bread counts failed to match, suspicion would immediately fall upon those responsible. Fear of denunciation was constant. Some personnel strictly followed every rule and were ready to report suspicious behavior. Any cooperation among sympathetic staff could look like organized disobedience. Thus, help had to remain entirely disconnected, silent, and untraceable. Despite these dangers, small forms of assistance were possible. Anna learned the rhythms of inspections, knowing when officials concentrated on other tasks. On those days, she allowed minor deviations. On others, she adhered strictly to regulations. Slowly, these actions formed a consistent pattern grounded in a moral choice. Outwardly, she remained a disciplined employee, but beneath that facade, she manipulated her limited authority to ease the suffering of those in the greatest need. In the spring of 1943, she did not view herself as part of any resistance. She was not connected to political groups or underground networks. Her actions emerged from direct observation of camp realities and from a growing belief that strict obedience contributed to the destruction of human lives. Every extra crumb provided a chance to survive one more day. Thus, an invisible line of quiet resistance formed inside the camp. It did not reveal itself in open defiance, but existed in careful, nearly undetected acts carried out by those who refused to accept the system's absolute dehumanization. By the summer of 1943, the situation in the camp had grown more complicated. Reports from the front increasingly mentioned heavy losses and withdrawals. Official propaganda continued to speak of steadfastness, yet internal documents stressed the need to economize all human and material resources. This affected the entire camp system directly. Supplies worsened, rations shrank, and disciplinary demands intensified. Under these conditions, the discreet acts of assistance offered by a few staff members became more deliberate. Instinctive gestures were no longer sufficient. New orders, more frequent inspections, and heightened suspicion required careful adaptation. Any discrepancy in the food ledgers or clothing inventories could trigger an inquiry. Thus, the question of trust became central. By this time, Anna had learned through observation that some colleagues also allowed themselves small deviations from instructions. A woman working in the clothing depot sometimes delayed discarding worn garments, allowing prisoners to keep them longer. Another, assigned to the laundry, overlooked the disappearance of relatively intact shirts that subtly made their way into the hands of the weakest. None of this was discussed openly. Any direct admission would have been dangerous. Instead, an invisible circle of trust formed gradually, built on cautious observations and indirect hints. In the staff canteen, Anna occasionally noticed how Martha, a kitchen worker, set aside crumbs before disposing of leftovers. Though technically allowed, her care suggested intent. Later, Anna saw that some bunks in certain barracks received small parcels containing those crumbs. These indirect signs indicated mutual understanding among a few staff members. One afternoon during shift change, Martha was briefly left alone near the kitchen entrance. As Anna passed by, their exchanged glances conveyed more than any words could. No explicit agreements were made, yet a shared awareness grew through subtle gestures and understated remarks about shortages or conditions on the front. Over time, a silent coordination emerged between several women. This circle never operated through explicit actions or communication, but through synchronized routines. If Martha left slightly more soup in a cauldron intended for a barrack housing the weakest prisoners, Anna ensured that this cauldron was delivered there and that ledgers reflected standard numbers. A colleague on the clothing depot adjusted her record so that slightly warmer garments reached those in greatest need. Nothing appeared coordinated, yet each gesture depended on another. Prisoners working on support tasks, such as kitchen cleaning or clothing sorting, unknowingly became part of this arrangement. They performed small acts that completed the chain of assistance. If a cauldron held a little more soup, they directed it to those suffering the most. If extra clothing reached the depot, they ensured it was placed into the right hands without drawing attention. There were no verbal agreements, only a shared understanding formed through repeated patterns. The system remained fragile. Certain members of the male guard staff were particularly strict and eager to report deviations. Fear of denunciation pervaded the camp. For this reason, the circle maintained absolute silence. Even a hint of coordination could be interpreted as conspiracy and lead to severe consequences. By the autumn of 1943, inspections became more frequent. Officials scrutinized ledgers, inventories, and daily reports. Meetings emphasized the need for absolute discipline. Women were warned about unacceptable emotional softness and informed that any leniency would be treated as a breach of loyalty. This forced the circle to adjust further. They began alternating methods of assistance to avoid recognizable patterns. Rations were redistributed irregularly. On some days, the circle refrained from action entirely. On others, they shifted focus to clothing or infirmary lists. They also took measures to mask discrepancies by compensating for any extra portions with reductions elsewhere. creating the illusion of accuracy. Conflicts between moral choices and regulations grew sharper. Sometimes orders required reduced rations for prisoners labeled low productivity, effectively condemning the weakest. The circle tried to mitigate the consequences by redirecting small quantities to those most affected. These actions were painstaking and risky, but they provided slight relief in an environment where survival depended on fractions. Emotional strain deepened. Staff had to maintain neutral expressions during disciplinary measures directed at prisoners. Outward compliance shielded them from suspicion, allowing the hidden work to continue. By the end of 1943, the invisible circle of trust had crystallized. It included several women in the guard force, a few prisoners on auxiliary tasks, and a set of small interlinked practices designed to bypass the rigid structure. The camp system, intended to be airtight, contained narrow cracks. Through these cracks flowed discrete acts of humanity by individuals who could not fully obey the system's dehumanizing logic. These cracks would later become vital pathways for even riskier and more decisive actions during the most difficult months ahead. The winter of 1943 and 1944 placed the camp in its most difficult state to that point. Supplies deteriorated to such an extent that even the personnel began to feel the effects of shortages. Meat rations disappeared from the staff canteen, bread portions were reduced, and previous temporary norms became permanent. Official documents explained these measures by the strain on the front and the need to divert resources to combat units. For prisoners, the situation was far more severe. Their rations shrank faster and more dramatically than those of the camp staff. At the same time, internal control tightened considerably. At the end of December 1943, an inspection commission arrived to verify records and supplies. Inspectors compared ledger entries with actual stocks in the kitchen and warehouses. They questioned even minor inconsistencies. One staff member was punished for a simple miscalculation in bread weights. Although she was not reassigned to frontline service, she lost leave privileges and a bonus, receiving a public reprimand. This incident served as a warning to all staff that even unintentional errors could be treated seriously. For Anna and the quiet circle around her, the period of intensified oversight required a reevaluation of their methods. The previous ways of redistributing soup or bread became too risky. Any deviation, even by a few grams, could raise suspicion. For several weeks, they refrained from active assistance, limiting themselves to observing prisoner conditions and monitoring the kitchen. During this enforced pause, Anna realized that the lack of small interventions increased the risk for those already close to collapse. Early in January 1944, conditions shifted slightly. The commission left, inspections became rarer, and staff received new duty schedules. One woman within the circle gained access to inventory logs that sometimes contained minor errors after supply deliveries. These clerical discrepancies created an opportunity. If the recorded amount of grain did not precisely match the stock, the difference could be attributed to shipment mistakes instead of internal misuse. With this leverage, their actions became more cautious and methodical. Instead of altering portions at the point of distribution, they redirected their efforts earlier in the supply chain. On days when new shipments arrived, they subtly used minor discrepancies to channel small quantities toward the kitchen under the guise of normal waste or processing loss. This required coordination, but reduced the likelihood of detection. Still, risk remained a constant presence. Anna felt tension during every shift. Any deviation in her movements, any unusual expression could attract attention. If a prisoner's recovery became too noticeable, it might raise questions. Help had to be precise, limited, and directed only toward those in the gravest condition who avoided drawing attention. Prisoners working in the kitchen or laundry became crucial intermediaries. Their positions provided access to leftovers or minor supplies, but they were also at high risk. If caught, they would suffer first. So Anna avoided direct contact, maintaining distance. Understanding emerged through routine. If one evening a cauldron contained a slightly richer broth, the auxiliaries knew whom to prioritize. If extra blankets appeared in the laundry inventory, they silently reached those in greatest need. Reports from the Eastern Front in this period became increasingly alarming. Radio bulletins in the administrative building described the advance of Soviet forces. Lines on maps moved westward. The approaching front amplified the anxiety of the command. This heightened atmosphere influenced every part of camp life. By midwinter, Anna recognized that risk had ceased to be an occasional factor. It became a structural part of her choices. She carried out her official tasks correctly, yet each action now passed through a silent internal calculus. She no longer saw herself as simply fulfilling duty. She felt responsible for the survival of specific individuals. This became particularly clear on an evening when she saw a prisoner from the heavy assembly line barely rising from his bunk. His hands trembled, and his movements were slow. Anna understood that without additional sustenance, he would likely not survive the winter. Yet, assisting him increased her own danger. Nevertheless, she and two colleagues devised a plan to direct leftover food toward him over several days. It was complex and required precision, but it succeeded. Unexpectedly, Anna discovered that the fear, which had once restrained her, now integrated into her daily actions. Risk became normal. It no longer served to deter her, but shaped her decisions. By late winter, it was evident that the camp entered a new and more perilous phase. Inspections intensified again. Supplies dwindled further, and the front drew nearer. But despite this escalating pressure, the invisible support network did not disintegrate. Instead, it expanded slightly as new staff members, confronted with the reality of camp life, sought ways to lessen suffering without exposing themselves. In these weeks, the hidden actions of Anna and her circle became not only a form of resistance, but a quiet assertion of humanity within a collapsing system. The spring of 1944 brought a state of transition to the camp. Command officials demanded increasingly strict obedience to all regulations, while the general course of the war created an atmosphere of instability. Radio reports grew more troubling, and the maps in the administrative building showed the front lines shifting steadily westward. Among the staff, conversations became more cautious, focused on how long the existing order might last. In this environment, the invisible circle of assistants faced new challenges. Their actions had become more dangerous, but also more necessary. The thawed ground and damp cold of spring led to respiratory illnesses spreading rapidly among the prisoners. The infirmary overflowed. Medications were scarce. Death rates climbed and appeared in ledgers as the expected outcome of overwork and shortages. Anna began noticing that certain prisoners working inside the camp, especially in kitchen and maintenance duties, had learned to read the subtle patterns of the quiet assistants. Without explicit instructions, they recognized which cauldron held a slightly fuller portion or which blankets had been routed differently. This understanding made the network more effective, but also riskier. If too many people sensed the pattern, even accidentally, the likelihood of exposure increased. To avoid drawing attention, the circle changed their methods frequently. Surplus portions never went to the same barrack twice in a row. Clothing assistants shifted irregularly. Some days they suspended all help to avoid creating a recognizable rhythm. Their work resembled a balancing act between need and invisibility. A difficult question grew more pressing, deciding who received priority when assistance was limited. Hundreds of prisoners required help, but resources were scarce. Over time, Anna gravitated toward those closest to collapse and those whose roles enabled the internal distribution of scarce advantages. These individuals served as essential links within the informal support system. Losing even one could weaken the entire structure. One such prisoner worked in the clothing depot, sorting worn garments. His position allowed him to place slightly warmer pieces into the circulation discreetly. Anna learned of his efforts only indirectly through the consistent appearance of better clothing among the weakest. But in early spring, a newly arrived male supervisor noticed irregularities in clothing allocations and began asking questions. He monitored the sorters' movements and reviewed records with unusual attention. This signaled that the quiet assistants had reached a visible threshold. In response, the circle suspended all clothing-related actions. Garments were too easy to track and too difficult to justify. Food redistribution was safer, as it could be concealed within kitchen waste or measurement variations. Although it was painful to abandon this avenue of help, it became a necessary compromise for survival. Around the same time, a new order arrived in early May 1944. It warned that any leniency toward prisoners would be treated as an act undermining discipline. The women were assembled for an instruction session, where the camp leadership listed examples of punishments in other camps. Staff who had shown undue softness had been sentenced or sent to military tribunals. These warnings were directed especially at the women, who were reminded that sentimentality would not be tolerated. This meeting made a strong impression on Anna. She clearly understood that the margin for hidden actions had narrowed dramatically. Those receiving help depended on it daily, but any misstep could lead to accusations of disloyalty. In the eyes of the leadership, even small deviations represented a threat to order. Yet stopping was impossible. Anna saw the physical state of those barely surviving and understood that withdrawing assistance would accelerate their decline. This created a constant internal conflict between professional risk and moral necessity. At the end of May 1944, she noticed a shift in inspection patterns. Checks became focused primarily on morning hours, when staff were occupied with work column formations. Evening oversight weakened. She used this window to direct small amounts of leftover broth or hot water toward the weakest prisoners. Evening waste was recorded less precisely, allowing tiny adjustments to pass unnoticed. But even these opportunities carried danger. Anna occasionally saw senior officers appear unexpectedly near the kitchen or administrative corridor. Their presence, unpredictable and quiet, served as a reminder that surveillance existed even when not visible. Despite these pressures, the invisible resistance persisted. It evolved from simple redistribution of resources into an increasingly calculated and precise act of survival strategy. Anna understood that these efforts would not change the system, but they could prolong a life, or many lives, by days or weeks. In the camp, time itself became a measure of dignity and endurance. By late spring, the circle had learned every nuance of the camp's routines. They adapted constantly, understanding that their actions operated on the fragile boundary between compassion and danger. The system pressed harder every month, yet within it still remained narrow spaces where humanity could persist if one acted carefully enough. By the summer of 1944, distant echoes of the war were increasingly felt even in the rear territories. The camp sensed this indirectly through heightened tension among command staff, repeated orders for readiness to evacuate, and accelerated briefings. New directives in the administrative building emphasized that all personnel must be prepared for immediate relocation of prisoners deeper into Germany. These documents carried urgent wording, reflecting growing concern within the leadership. For Anna and the invisible circle of assistants, this shift posed new risks. Previously, the danger stemmed from possible discovery during routine operations. Now, the threat came from the overall destabilization of the system. Any evacuation would dismantle the fragile internal network they had built. Prisoners who depended on their support could be placed in harsher conditions, and the continuity of help would be broken. Under these circumstances, time itself became a critical factor. In June 1944, inspections of inventories and food ledgers intensified. Command demanded exact matching of records, with any discrepancy treated as potential negligence. This scrutiny extended to the kitchen, storage, and laundry, precisely the sites where quiet assistance occurred. Anna and her colleagues were forced to reduce even very small deviations. Their room for action narrowed sharply, even as the physical condition of prisoners worsened. Prisoners working in internal services tried to adapt as well. Those assigned to kitchen cleaning or maintenance became more cautious, avoiding any step that could appear intentional. Whenever possible, they redirected leftover waste or remnants toward the weakest. But the tightening of oversight limited what could be hidden. This forced Anna to look for alternative ways. One such method involved distributing hot water or thin vegetable residue left in cauldrons after evening cleaning. Because these liquids were not subject to strict measurement, they could be offered discreetly during late hours. Although not substantial nourishment, they reduced dehydration and eased hunger. It was a minimal but vital support for those in critical condition. Another growing threat was the arrival of a new deputy commandant. Known for rigid discipline, he conducted unexpected rounds, demanded detailed reports, and insisted that both staff and prisoners meet standards without exception. His presence increased the risk of exposure for Anna's circle. Even minor irregularities could trigger suspicion under his watch. One evening, Anna observed him interrogating the camp physician about the rising number of exhausted prisoners. He examined mortality lists closely, comparing dates and work assignments. This attention signaled that leadership might soon begin searching for causes of irregularities. If they investigated food or clothing distributions too deeply, any subtle act of assistance could surface. In mid-July, the camp received a directive requiring partial evacuation preparations. Staff were instructed on escorting prisoner columns. The uncertainties of this order created an atmosphere of mounting tension. Those who were physically weak faced an especially bleak future if forced onto long marches. Among the staff, a hidden anxiety grew. Some openly doubted the prospects of victory. Others stayed silent. But the overall mood darkened. In such an environment, any deviation from duty was treated as a sign of unreliability. For Anna, the risk of discovery became more personal and immediate. Yet, despite the worsening pressure, the invisible network endured. It adapted by shifting focus. Instead of directing assistance through portion sizes, the circle concentrated on intangible support, regulating which prisoners appeared on certain lists, delaying infirmary transfers, and manipulating work assignments to prevent the weakest from collapsing. By late July 1944, it was evident that the burden on the camp would continue to increase. The front drew nearer, inspections became more aggressive, and orders changed rapidly. But inside this mounting chaos, Anna's actions gained a deeper internal meaning. She saw her efforts not as isolated gestures, but as a consistent, deliberate stance within a system collapsing under its own brutality. The risk had grown. The space for help had narrowed, but the moral boundaries they had shaped through months of quiet actions remained. And within those boundaries, even under the shadow of war, they continued to protect the fragile lives of those who could not protect themselves. August 1944 became a turning point when the camp entered a state of constant alarm. Command received increasingly frequent messages about breakthroughs at the front and losses that could no longer be concealed even in official reports. Updated maps in the administrative building showed Soviet forces advancing steadily toward the region where the camp was located. The atmosphere changed, and every shift for the staff turned into a period of uncertainty and restrained tension. Administration tried to maintain strict order. Additional briefings were held, patrols were strengthened, and early in August, a directive required preparing prisoners for evacuation. The wording was harsh. Columns were to be assembled quickly, and anyone unable to walk was subject to alternative measures. The meaning of these instructions was unmistakable. The camp stood on the threshold of events that could drastically reduce the number of survivors. Anna understood that the remaining window for assistance was rapidly closing. The invisible circles still functioned, but under overwhelming pressure. Martha, working in the kitchen, quietly indicated that food stocks had diminished so severely that even tiny redistributions were becoming noticeable. A warehouse audit revealed shortages, prompting the appointment of a new controller. Any attempt to divert supplies now carried immediate danger. Prisoners sensed the growing threat as well. Exhaustion, illness, expectations of evacuation, and rumors about harsh treatment of columns in other areas created widespread anxiety. Conversations in the barracks became more frequent, though still cautious. Many understood that evacuation meant losing even the minimal support that existed inside the camp. Under these conditions, Anna and her colleagues shifted their focus. Direct food redistribution had become nearly impossible. Instead, they concentrated on the internal classification of prisoners. Daily lists determined who was assigned to work groups, who was directed to the infirmary, and who might be included in initial evacuation columns. If a weak prisoner was labeled temporarily unfit, he or she might remain in the camp longer. This administrative maneuver sometimes preserved a life, at least temporarily. They also tried to use other small opportunities. Fuel was strictly rationed, but occasionally small remnants of firewood remained. Anna ensured these leftovers reached barracks with the most vulnerable prisoners. This did not improve nutrition but helped them survive cold nights, which posed serious risk of respiratory infections. In August, a new danger emerged: preparations to destroy documents. Leadership received orders to organize the removal or disposal of archives. Staff whispered that certain records would be burned to conceal evidence of deaths and irregularities. Anna realized that once the destruction began, deviations in food or clothing numbers might be scrutinized retrospectively. Any inconsistencies could later be interpreted as deliberate violations. Night drills started in September. Staff were woken without warning, and prisoners were taken outside for inspection at any hour. These checks were rigid. Any hesitation, any misplaced item, any delay could attract suspicion. Assistance required near-perfect precision. The Circle used its accumulated experience to avoid patterns and reduce visibility of their actions. A particularly dangerous incident occurred in mid-September. Leftover food in a cauldron beyond what was recorded was discovered during evening cleaning. The controller documented the details, questioned staff, and compared the findings with ledger entries. Anna was present during part of the inspection and understood how easily suspicion could fall on the wrong person. Fortunately, Martha managed to explain the discrepancy as normal spillage from early ladling. The episode served as a stark reminder of how narrow their margin of safety had become. Despite this, the Circle did not dissolve. Instead, they turned their focus toward organizational protection. Instead of smuggling resources, they shielded the weakest by adjusting work rosters and delaying their inclusion in evacuation lists. They aimed to keep them inside the camp during the early evacuation stages when survival rates were lowest. By late September, the camp showed clear signs of systemic deterioration. External authority weakened, while internal discipline tightened unpredictably. In this contradictory environment, Anna's quiet work continued. She understood that discovery could lead to punishment, yet stopping was impossible. Her actions had shifted from simple compassion to a structured, measured form of moral resistance. Time was running out. Supplies were shrinking. Inspections were tightening. The front was approaching. But even as the system neared collapse, Anna remained committed to helping those whose lives depended on her ability to navigate the narrowing space between duty and humanity. The autumn of 1944 brought a state of instability in which urgency, accelerating processes, and the gradual disintegration of order merged into daily routine. In mid-October, the camp leadership received new instructions, emphasizing readiness for immediate evacuation. These directives stated that the camp must be cleared of prisoners in optimal time, that inventories must be reconciled, and that documentation must match official standards. The language indicated an effort to conceal extensive deterioration within the camp. Chaos became constant. Staff remained alert at all hours, and prisoners lived in anxious anticipation. Rumors spread in the barracks about evacuation columns elsewhere, suffering heavy losses. Even strict nighttime inspections could not suppress these fears. The weakest understood that evacuation meant extremely high risk, and many doubted they could endure a long forced march. Anna felt that her actions were entering a new phase. The invisible network she and her colleagues had built operated with precision, but its previous methods became less effective. Direct assistance through food or clothing was nearly impossible. Instead, their focus shifted toward protecting prisoners through administrative decisions and delaying tactics. In early October, Anna began adjusting medical and work status records. Prisoners near collapse were left in categories labeled temporarily unfit, keeping them out of the first evacuation groups. This did not guarantee safety, but every postponed transfer increased their chances of surviving the coming weeks. Anna carefully avoided drawing attention. She ensured that her adjustments blended into the normal variability of reports. Resource management also required adaptation. Supplies were critically low, but their very scarcity offered moments of concealment. Anna helped maintain consistency in food distribution records while subtly guiding small remnants, such as hot water or thin broth, to those who needed them most. These efforts, although modest, helped prevent sudden declines among the weakest. November 1944 brought the most difficult decisions. A directive ordered the formation of the first evacuation column. The instructions stated that the pace must be fast and the prisoners maximally able-bodied. This meant that anyone who could stand or walk, even briefly, was to be included. Anna faced the most challenging moral calculation of her service, helping certain individuals remain off the list while preventing detection. She used her knowledge of camp logistics. In the days before the scheduled departure, the leadership ordered extensive inspections. Anna discreetly arranged for some of the most fragile prisoners to be reassigned or moved temporarily to less visible areas during critical inspections. This was not a guarantee of safety, but it shifted the immediate danger away from those least able to survive the march. Meanwhile, the broader administrative structure weakened. Some staff questioned the future, others hardened their behavior, driven by fear or ideological rigidity. The camp's internal dynamics became unpredictable. A single officer's suspicion or arbitrary decision could destroy the fragile protective system Anna had helped maintain. By early December, the camp lived in near total uncertainty. The first evacuation column departed, and by evening, stories circulated about the harsh conditions on the road. Many prisoners understood that evacuation was often synonymous with death. Those who remained behind were mainly the sick, or those whose records Anna had helped adjust. For them, staying inside the camp, even a collapsing one, offered a marginally higher chance of survival. Administrative control shifted again as the destruction of documents accelerated. Ledger books disappeared or were rendered incomplete. Formal procedures fragmented. In this environment, strict accounting became less important, but unpredictable orders became more frequent. Anna recognized that while bureaucratic risks diminished, personal risks increased. Her priority became maintaining outward discipline while ensuring hidden assistance did not stand out. She avoided disputes, adhered strictly to visible rules, and minimized movements that could attract attention. Meanwhile, she used every remaining opportunity to prevent the weakest prisoners from being included in subsequent evacuation groups. By late December, it became clear that the camp would not maintain its structure for much longer. The front approached, and discussions among the staff increasingly focused on abandonment scenarios. Anna understood that the dissolution unfolding around her was the natural end of a system stretched beyond its limits. Just before Christmas, the final preparations for full evacuation began. Some prisoners she had protected remained classified as unfit for immediate transfer. This outcome temporary, as it was represented the last tangible result of months of cautious actions. It extended their survival into a period when external events, not internal decisions, would determine whether they lived. As the camp dismantled its remaining structures, Anna sensed the completion of her hidden role. Much of what had occurred would remain undocumented and unrecognized. There were no formal records, no acknowledgments, only a sequence of quiet choices through which a small group of women attempted to preserve fragments of human dignity in a place designed to erase it. Thus, the final stage of the camp's existence revealed the depth of its internal contradictions. Absolute control paired with collapsing authority, rigid rules dissolving into chaos, and within that turmoil, a fragile line of silent resistance sustained by individuals who refused to surrender their humanity.